Okay, Vincent Povey at Blakehill. We're looking at waypoint number 5 now, which is an interesting part of the airfield. We've come through, we've doubled back from ourselves from the Oakham Furrows site. We've turned to our right and we've come through a gate across the old perimeter track. We've walked through that gate and we're now looking to our right at a large tree in a field. Behind that tree there is a large bump in the ground, which is fenced off, and slightly to the left of that bump in the ground there is a hedge which is on the skyline, which you will see basically a gap in there, which should be in front of you. This is an important part of the airfield infrastructure. This part of the airfield is basically where the gliders were stored for D-Day and for Arnhem. The gap in the hedge, as you see in front of you, is wide enough for the wingspan of a Horsa glider to fit through. And it was in this neighbouring field where the gliders were stored in preparation. Now, glider practice at Blakehill I learned from my good friend Staff Sergeant Laurie Whedon, who's sadly no longer with us, from the Glider Pilot Regiment. The gliders were never designed to land on a runway, they were designed to land on grass. So glider practice at all of these airfields was a pretty hit and miss affair, and there were gliders coming down all over the place and taking off all over the place. What would aid them in their landing was a smoke barrel, some of which can be found in the hedgerow just over there where that gap actually is, and some of these still exist. They would light these barrels filled with tar, which would produce an acrid black smoke which would blow across the airfield and would give an indication of the wind direction. The Horsa glider was designed to land upwind, and it would land at a virtual standstill in good conditions. However, I did get a quote from Staff Sergeant Laurie Whedon mentioning to me that when he left on the 5th of June here in 1944 to land in Normandy, he ended up landing downwind with a 27-knot breeze on his tail and couldn't get the thing down. He quotes that it was about the speed of Concorde, so he just had to shut his eyes and slam it down onto the deck. They were brave, brave men. What we're going to do now is look to our right-hand side, which is where the bump is in front of us, behind the tree in front of us, and this is part of RAF Blakehill's Cold War history. This is in fact a Royal Observer Corps nuclear bunker. Around 1955, the Royal Observer Corps underground monitoring posts were installed across the UK. There was a threat of nuclear war. There probably still is, from Russia, from the Eastern Bloc. There were approximately 1,560 bunkers across the UK, many of which now have been demolished. There was a crew of 3 men, or women, which were not expected to survive more than a month in the event of an all-out attack. It's chilling to think that in the days before the internet, mobile phones and satellite communications, the only way to report back to the government of the day that Wiltshire had been hit by a nuclear attack was to rely on a physical network of bunkers that could relay messages back via ultra-high frequency radio. We know that one of the targets around here was the American Air Base Fairford, which is 13 miles away from RAF Blakehill. So using estimates based on the yield from the weapons aimed at us during the 1970s and 80s, the nearby town of Cricklade would have been destroyed, and the resulting fireball would have killed many thousands across Swindon and Cirencester. The radioactive fallout would have travelled northeast. Once an attack had taken place, the crew of the bunker in front of you had a number of instruments to gather information on the nature of the attack, location, direction, fallout, size of device, or whether it was a ground or airburst detonation. The first of these instruments was called a ground zero indicator, and this would sit on top of the concrete plinth that you may be able to see in front of you, nestled within the bump behind the tree. The ground zero indicator consisted of a 4 horizontally mounted cardinal compass point pinhole camera with a white enamelled metal drum. Each camera contained a sheet of photosensitive paper mounted within a clear plastic cassette on which were printed horizontal and vertical calibration lines delineating compass bearing and elevation above the horizon. The bright flash from a nuclear explosion would burn a mark on one of the two papers within the drum. The position of the burn spot enabled the bearing and height of the burst to be estimated. With triangulation between neighbouring posts, these readings would give an accurate height and position. A ground or near ground burst would produce radioactive fallout, whereas an air burst would produce only short distance and short-lived initial radiations. Once combined with the peak overpressure readings from the bomb power indicator, the readings of the power of the burst in megatons could be calculated by a triangulation team in the group control building using a handheld plastic calculator device. Remember, there were no apps to download for nuclear war. The only way to get these readings was to retrieve the film. The bunker had to be opened up and an observer would go above ground following the blast to retrieve the film. Remember that when you have a bad day at work. Another instrument on top was the bomb power indicator. This mount for the instrument still survives to this day and is very, very easy to trip over if you go over there. This was literally a pair of circular plated baffles, and it was literally an anemometer, which was a wind power device which would spin, and the pressure of the wind would give a readout in the bunker below, and they could estimate the speed of the air travelling above the bunker, and they could triangulate that with the data they had depending on the size of the bomb. There was another third instrument on top of the bunker, which was a fixed survey meter, which was a radiac meter head, and that was basically there to measure ionised gamma radiation that was in the atmosphere at that time. The nearest Royal Observer Corps bunkers to the site was Kemble, which was directly linked to Blakehill, North Cerney, which was directly linked to Blakehill, Malmesbury, which has now been demolished, Chippenham, which has now been demolished, Rawton, which was built to replace one at Toot Hill, Swindon, which kept flooding, was later demolished, Ogbourne St George, which is now demolished. 3 now remain at Poulton, Northleach and Avebury. In 1967, the Government Communication Headquarters, GCHQ, set up an experimental radio and monitoring station. If you were to turn to your left and look across the plateau where we've come from, where the runways were, you would have been able to see a large radio mast which stood right in the centre of that plateau, and this was a landmark for many, many years. It was a relocated chain home mast from the Eastern Counties chain home radar. There was a bunker to the northeast of this mast where the Russian secret police were being monitored. The bunker still exists, but I'm not allowed to tell you where it is. There is much that we don't know about the Cold War experiments at RAF Blakehill, but we do know that there is another site towards the end of our tour today, which I'll give you some information on as we go there. There's plenty of other things to show you. What we're going to do now is we're going to carry on down the perimeter track. We're going to make our way down over towards the central plateau. We're going to turn to our right, and I'm going to talk about airfield lighting.